There is a moment in every warrior's life when he realizes that the blood on his hands will never wash clean, when the weight of what he has become crushes the memory of what he once was. For Sanguinius, that moment came not in the heat of battle, not in the screaming chaos of Zeno's wars or the betrayal of brother Primarchs, but in the silence afterward, when the cheering stopped and he was left alone with the faces of the dead. They say he was the most beautiful of the Emperor's sons, a living angel with wings of purest white and a face that could inspire entire worlds to kneel in devotion. They say he was perfection incarnated, the embodiment of nobility and martial grace. But perfection, in the grim darkness of the far future, is a curse more terrible than any mutation. Because when you are built to be an angel, when billions look to you as the living proof of humanity's divine right to rule the stars, you cannot afford to be human. You cannot afford to bleed. You cannot afford to fall. And yet Sanguinius bled more than any of them. He bled in ways that had nothing to do with wounds. He carried a secret so monstrous that it threatened to destroy everything he had built, a flaw written into his very genes that turned his sons into ravening beasts, and he smiled through it all with a beauty that broke hearts. This is not a story of triumph. This is a story of a man who was never allowed to be a man, who wore wings like shackles and bore the weight of an empire's hope while knowing, with absolute certainty, that he was going to die screaming. Before we descend into the beautiful horror of Sanguinius's existence, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates the tragic grandeur of Warhammer 40K, and subscribe to the channel. The Imperium's darkest truths deserve to be witnessed, and your support ensures we can keep bringing these stories to light. Now, let us step into the blood-soaked shadow of the angel. The pod screamed as it tore through the atmosphere of Bal Secundus, a falling star that split the poison sky with a trail of fire and ionized metal. It carved a trench through the rad wastes, scattering irradiated dust and vitrified sand, and when it finally came to rest in the shadow of a dead hive city, the silence that followed was almost reverent. Almost. Because in the wastelands of Bal Secundus, silence never lasted. The mutant tribes were already moving, drawn by the crash like carrion birds to a fresh kill, their twisted forms loping across dunes that glowed faintly with the residue of ancient atomics. They came expecting salvage, maybe technology from the distant past when humanity still reached for the stars with hope instead of desperation. What they found instead was a child. He was perfect in the way that made the mutants recoil, because perfection on Bal Secundus was an obscenity. His skin was unmarked by radiation scarring, his limbs proportional and whole, his face structured with a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical in its precision. And then there were the wings. They emerged from his back in twin arcs of white feathers, each plume pristine despite the ash and blood coating the pod's interior, and they stirred weakly as the infant breathed. The mutants, these were the folk of pure blood, though their name was a bitter joke given how far they had fallen from baseline human, stood in a circle around the pod and did not speak. Their leader, a woman whose name has been lost to history but whose actions would shape the fate of the galaxy, reached into the wreckage and lifted the child free. He did not cry. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to contain something older than an infant should possess, and in that moment, the decision was made. They named him Sanguinius, a word from a half-remembered prayer that meant of blood, though whether it referred to kinship or violence, none of them could say. They took him into their tribe not as a slave or a curiosity, but as one of their own, and in doing so, committed an act of compassion that the galaxy would never see repeated. Because the folk of pure blood understood something that the Imperium, in all its militant certainty, could not. That monstrosity was not defined by form, but by action. The child had wings, yes, but so did many of their number have extra limbs, vestigial heads, organs that pulsed visibly through translucent skin. Mutation was the language of Bal Secundus, the dialect of survival in a world where the very air was hostile. Sanguinius was simply another word in that language, and if his particular mutation happened to be beautiful instead of grotesque, Well, beauty was just another form of difference. He grew at a speed that defied explanation, his body maturing in months what should have taken years, and with that growth came an intelligence that terrified as much as it inspired. By the time he could walk, he could speak in full sentences, asking questions about the world that the tribe struggled to answer because their own knowledge was fragmented, passed down through generations of oral tradition and half-understood legend. He learned that Bal Secundus was a moon orbiting a larger world called Bal, that both were locked in a death spiral of environmental collapse following wars so ancient that even their causes had been forgotten. He learned that water was more precious than gold, that the great hive cities were tombs filled with treasures and horrors in equal measure, and that the mutant tribes were all that remained of a population that once numbered in the billions. He learned to hunt the great rad scorpions that burrowed through the dunes, their stings capable of liquefying organs in seconds, and he learned to navigate by the position of stars that burned with unnatural colors in the poison sky. But more than facts, more than survival skills, Sanguinius learned what it meant to be loved. The folk of pure blood fed him from their own meager rations, taught him their songs and stories, and never once demanded that he be anything other than himself. They marveled at his wings but did not worship them. They respected his growing strength but did not fear it. And when other tribes raided their camps, when the violence that was woven into the fabric of Bal Secundus inevitably came calling, they protected him with a ferocity that transcended mere duty. This was family, not in the genetic sense that the emperor would later engineer with his primarchs, but in the deeper sense of chosen connection. These people had nothing, possessed nothing, were nothing by the Imperium standards, and yet they gave everything they had to a child who was not even their species anymore. The irony would haunt Sanguinius for the rest of his life, that the only people who ever loved him without condition were mutants that his future empire would classify as abominations to be purged on sight. That the only home he ever truly had was a rad-scarred wasteland where survival was measured in days and hope was a luxury no one could afford. But as a child, he did not yet understand irony. He understood only that when the night winds howled with the voices of the dead, when the temperature dropped to levels that could freeze blood in minutes, his tribe huddled together and shared warmth. He understood that when food was scarce, the adults ate last so the children could have their fill. He understood that strength was not just the ability to kill, but the willingness to endure so others might live. His first kill was a raider from the Red Sands tribe, a hulking brute with arms that ended in bone spurs instead of hands. Sanguinius was 6 years old by chronological measure, though his body had the size and development of a young adult. The raider had come in the night, seeking to steal water from the folks' hidden cistern, and he had killed 2 of the tribe's elders before Sanguinius even understood what was happening. There was no thought involved, no strategy or technique. One moment he was sleeping beside the communal fire, and the next he was moving, his wings propelling him across the sand with a speed that seemed to warp the air itself. He hit the raider with the full force of his unnatural momentum, and his hands, those perfect unmarked hands, closed around the brute's throat and simply squeezed. The sound of vertebrae snapping was lost beneath the raider's final wet gasp, and when Sanguinius stood, his hands were covered in blood for the first time. He expected to feel horror, or guilt, or some reaction that matched the gravity of taking a life. Instead, he felt nothing. The body at his feet was just meat, no different than the rad scorpions he butchered for food, and the ease of the kill was more disturbing than the act itself. The tribe celebrated his victory, marked his face with ash in the traditional signs of a warrior's first blood, and he smiled because that was what they expected. But inside, in the part of him that was not yet fully formed but was already far too aware, Sanguinius recognized something fundamental. He was built for this. His body had been engineered at a cellular level to be a weapon, and violence came to him as naturally as breathing. The realization was a cold weight in his chest, because if he was a weapon, then who decided what he was pointed at? Who decided when the killing stopped? The years that followed were a blur of raids and counter-raids, of tribal politics and desperate alliances. Sanguinius grew into his role as the tribe's protector, and his reputation spread across the wastes like radiation, inevitable and transforming. Other tribes began to speak of the Angel of Baal, a winged warrior who could not be killed, who moved through battles like a storm given human form. Some came seeking alliance, offering tribute in exchange for protection. Others came seeking to prove themselves, to claim the glory of being the one who grounded the angel. All of them learned the same lesson. Sanguinius was not just faster or stronger than baseline humans. He was operating on a different level of existence entirely. His wings gave him mobility that turned three-dimensional tactics into child's play. His strength let him wield weapons that would require two normal men to lift. And his mind, that terrible, beautiful mind, processed combat scenarios with a clarity that turned every fight into a foregone conclusion. But it was not his martial prowess that truly unified the tribes. It was his vision. Because Sanguinius looked at the wasteland of Baal Secundus and refused to accept that this was all humanity deserved. He began to speak of building something permanent, of reclaiming the dead hive cities and turning them into strongholds, of establishing trade routes and resource sharing between tribes that had spent generations killing each other over contaminated water. He spoke with a passion that transcended mere rhetoric, and people listened because when Sanguinius spoke of hope, he made it feel real. He made it feel possible. And slowly, impossibly, the tribes began to unify. Not through conquest, though there was plenty of that, but through something more dangerous and more fragile: belief. The Angel's Tears was what they called the first settlement, a cluster of reclaimed structures in the shadow of a fallen spire that still bore the scars of whatever apocalyptic weapon had toppled it millennia ago. Sanguinius oversaw every detail of its construction, from the water reclamation systems to the defensive perimeters, and he did so while maintaining a fiction that grew heavier with every passing day. Because the tribes looked at him with worship now, not love. They knelt when he passed, touched the hem of his robes for luck, whispered prayers to him when they thought he could not hear. He had become their god, and gods did not get to be human. Gods did not get to admit fear or doubt. Gods did not get to wake screaming from nightmares where the faces of everyone they had killed stood in judgment. So Sanguinius smiled, and the smile was perfect, and behind it he was screaming. The work of unification was brutality dressed in noble language. For every tribe that joined peacefully, two more had to be crushed, their warriors slaughtered and their resources seized. Sanguinius told himself it was necessary, that the suffering of the few was justified by the survival of the many, but the logic felt hollow every time he watched a settlement burn. The worst were the tribes that had been corrupted by the same radiation that saturated the world, their mutations having progressed beyond mere physical deformity into something that affected their minds. They attacked with suicidal fervor, driven by visions and madness, and Sanguinius had to kill them all because there was no reasoning with insanity. He did it efficiently, methodically, and with a grace that made the butchery look almost artistic. His sons, when they finally came into being, would inherit this contradiction: the ability to commit atrocities while maintaining an aesthetic perfection that made the horror almost bearable to witness. There was a moment, near the end of the Unification Wars, when Sanguinius stood alone atop the highest point of the Angel's Tears and looked out across the territory he had claimed. The settlements glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight of Baal Secundus, and he could see the smoke from communal fires, hear the distant sounds of construction and daily life. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of something he could not name. The boy who had been found in a crashed pod, who had been loved by mutants and raised in compassion, was gone. In his place stood a leader, a symbol, a weapon honed by necessity and expectation. And somewhere in the transition, he had lost the ability to simply be. The folk of pure blood, his first family, still lived in the settlement. They were old now, their bodies failing in the ways that all mortal flesh eventually failed, and they looked at him with pride mixed with something sadder, recognition that he had outgrown them. The woman who had pulled him from the wreckage, who had cradled him when he woke from nightmares and taught him the old songs, lay dying in a shelter made from salvaged metal. Sanguinius sat beside her, holding her hand with a gentleness that seemed impossible given what those hands had done, and she smiled at him with blackened teeth. "You were always going to leave us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. "Not because you wanted to, but because you are something we were never meant to keep." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that he would stay and rule the unified tribes and build something that would endure. But the lies tasted like ash in his mouth, and he found he could not speak them. So instead he simply held her hand until the breathing stopped, until the warmth faded, and then he walked out into the wasteland and spread his wings and flew. He flew until the settlements were just points of light below him, until the curve of the moon became visible against the bulk of Baal itself, and he screamed into the wind because it was the only place where no one could hear him. The scream contained everything he could not say, all the weight of becoming something more than human and less than free, and when it finally ended, he descended back to the surface and put the perfect smile back on his face. Because that was what the angel did. He endured. He inspired. He lied with every breath and called it leadership, and the galaxy would love him for it. The Emperor's arrival was not gentle. The golden battleships tore through Baal's gravity well with the certainty of celestial bodies, their presence so overwhelming that even the most isolated tribes felt the pressure change in their bones. Sanguinius stood in the center of the angel's tears and looked up at the sky, and for the first time since his childhood, he felt fear. Not the fear of death, which he had long since made peace with, but the fear of inadequacy. Because he knew, with the same precognitive certainty that sometimes showed him fragments of futures he could not prevent, that the being descending toward his world was the one who had made him. His creator. His father, though that word felt wrong in ways he did not yet have the language to articulate. The meeting was brief and devoid of the warmth Sanguinius had imagined in the rare moments he allowed himself to fantasize about origins. The Emperor stood in his golden armor, a figure so saturated with psychic power that looking directly at him was like staring into a sun, and he appraised his son with eyes that measured and calculated and found the equation acceptable. There were no embraces, no words of comfort or explanations for why Sanguinius had been cast into the void as an infant. There was only purpose. The Emperor spoke of the Great Crusade, of humanity's manifest destiny to reclaim the stars, and he offered Sanguinius a place in that grand design. Not as a son, but as a tool, a weapon, a symbol to inspire the masses and lead armies across the black gulf between stars. Sanguinius accepted because refusal was not truly an option, and because some part of him, the part that still craved meaning beyond survival, wanted to believe that his existence served a purpose larger than tribal politics on a dying moon. He was given command of the 9 Legion, the Space Marines who had been created using his own genetic template, and he looked upon his sons and felt a pride so fierce it bordered on pain. They were magnificent. Each one a warrior sculpted from flesh and genecraft to be the ultimate expression of human martial prowess, and they all carried pieces of him in their DNA. His speed, his strength, his savage grace in combat. They called him father, and he wanted to weep because finally, he had a family that could keep pace with him, that understood the weight of being more than human. And then the first one fell to the thirst. It happened on a compliance action against a minor Xenos empire, something that should have been routine. The battle was already won, the enemy broken and fleeing, when one of the 9 legions suddenly turned on his own squad. Brother Kale, his name was, a veteran of 30 campaigns and a warrior renowned for his discipline. He tore out his battle brother's throat with his teeth and began to drink. his helmet's vox grill broadcasting wet gulping sounds that cut through the combat chatter like a scream. By the time the rest of the company restrained him, Cale had killed 3 of his own and wounded a dozen more, and his eyes were empty of anything resembling sanity. Just hunger. Just endless, burning need. Sanguinius ordered him executed immediately and the body destroyed, the ashes scattered in the void where no one could examine them. He classified the entire incident under a seal that only he could access, and when he addressed the Legion afterward, he spoke of enemy mind weapons and psychic corruption, of the need for vigilance against Zeno's trickery. The lies came easily, smoothly, because he had been practicing them his entire life. But in private, alone in his chambers aboard the Red Tier, he pulled up the genetic analysis that his apothecaries had managed to compile before he ordered the evidence destroyed, and he stared at the data until his eyes burned. The thirst was not external corruption. It was written into the genetic code itself, a flaw in the process that had created the 9 Legion from his own template. Somewhere in the transfiguration from his DNA to theirs, something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the result was a hunger that overwrote personality and training and left only a beast wearing human skin. The analysis suggested it was recessive, that most of the Legion would never manifest symptoms, but recessive was not the same as absent. The flaw was there, dormant, waiting. And Sanguinius knew with absolute certainty that if the Emperor discovered this defect, the 9 Legion would be declared flawed and expunged. 10,000 of his sons, warriors who trusted him and followed him and called him father, would be systematically exterminated like diseased livestock. So he buried the evidence and prayed to gods he did not believe in that Cale was an isolated incident. The galaxy, indifferent to prayer, proved him wrong within a month. The pattern emerged slowly enough that Sanguinius could almost convince himself he was imagining it. A battle brother would lose control during combat, their discipline fracturing into berserk fury that did not stop when the enemy was dead. They would turn on Imperial army auxiliaries, on civilians they were supposed to be protecting, on each other. The hunger was always the same, a need to consume blood that transcended thirst and became existential imperative. Sanguinius established containment protocols hidden within standard operating procedures, code phrases that meant a brother had fallen and needed to be restrained immediately. He expanded the apothecarian and personally vetted every member, ensuring their loyalty was to him first and the Imperium second. He created black site facilities where the afflicted could be held in secret, and when it became clear that there was no treatment, no cure, he gave the order that haunted him ever after: mercy killings, conducted in private, with the bodies destroyed and the records falsified. His apothecaries became executioners, and Sanguinius became a liar of such profound depth that he sometimes lost track of which version of reality was true. The official casualty reports listed deaths in battle, heroic sacrifices made in the Emperor's name. The sealed reports that only Sanguinius could access told a different story: fratricide, summary execution, genetic defect. And with each death, the weight on his soul grew heavier, until he felt like he was drowning in guilt even while his face remained a mask of perfect nobility. The worst part was not the killing. The worst part was that his sons knew. Not the specifics, not the full extent of the flaw, but they felt it in their blood. They woke from dreams where they tasted copper and craved violence beyond any tactical necessity, and they looked to their pre-march for answers. And Sanguinius looked back at them with eyes that held too many secrets and told them it was nothing, just the stress of constant warfare, just the burden of being the Emperor's chosen. He told them to meditate, to embrace discipline, to remember their oaths. And they believed him because he was their father, and fathers did not lie. Except this one did. He lied every single day, with every breath, and the lies metastasized into a cancer that ate at his foundations. The other primarchs began to notice that something was wrong with their brother. Not the specifics, because Sanguinius was too careful for that, but they sensed the strain. Robert Gilliman, ever pragmatic, commented on the 9 legions' higher-than-average attrition rate and suggested logistical reforms. Sanguinius thanked him and implemented none of them because the real losses could not be addressed through supply chain optimization. Rogel Dorn, blunt as a fortress wall, asked directly if there were problems within the legion that required intervention. Sanguinius smiled his perfect smile and assured his brother that everything was under control, that the 9 merely faced the galaxy's horrors with such fervor that they sometimes paid a steeper price. Dorn accepted the explanation because he wanted to believe it, because doubting Sanguinius felt like doubting the possibility of nobility itself. But some of his brothers were less easily deceived. Lion L. Johnson, the Dark Angel's master of secrets, watched Sanguinius with eyes that saw too much and said nothing, but his silence felt like accusation. Lehman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, made jokes about the IX's love of close combat and their tendency to paint everything red, and beneath the humor was a warning that he would do what needed to be done if the Blood Angels became a threat. And Conrad Kurz, already descending into the madness that would define his legion's future, looked at Sanguinius during a war council and laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and said, "You are so beautiful, brother, and so full of lies. I wonder which will shatter first, your wings or your conscience." Sanguinius said nothing, but later that night he reviewed the surveillance footage of the council chamber over and over, watching Kurz's face, trying to understand if the Night Haunter knew or was simply projecting his own corruption outward. The uncertainty was acid in his veins, because if Kurz knew, then others might know, and if others knew, then the fiction Sanguinius had built would collapse. The 9 Legion would be destroyed, his sons slaughtered, and he would be remembered not as the angel but as the deceiver, the Primarch whose genetic legacy was so flawed that it could not be allowed to continue. He began to avoid his brothers when possible, citing operational demands and crusade logistics. The isolation made everything worse, turned the spiral of guilt and fear into a feedback loop that had no exit. And still the thirst claimed more victims. The number of deaths he had to cover up increased each year, and the measures required to maintain secrecy became more extreme. Entire squads were seconded to black operations that did not officially exist, their casualties attributed to warp accidents or enemy ambushes. Sanguinius personally reviewed every after-action report, personally signed off on every falsified document, and the weight of those signatures felt like anchors tied to his soul. His visions, always sporadic and unreliable, began to intensify. He saw glimpses of a future where the thirst consumed entire chapters, where his sons tore through imperial worlds like a plague. He saw himself standing before the Emperor, trying to explain, trying to justify, and he saw the disappointment in his father's eyes before the order of extermination was given. He saw other things too, darker things, a black ship, a throne of pain, betrayal wearing the face of a beloved brother. But those visions were so fragmented and terrible that he pushed them away, refused to examine them too closely because he already carried more weight than any being should have to bear. So Sanguinius did what he had always done. He endured. He painted over the cracks with nobility and grace. He led his sons from the front in battles that grew progressively more savage, and he smiled for the remembrancers who documented the Great Crusade's glories. He became the Imperium's perfect angel, the Primarch whose beauty and heroism inspired entire sectors to compliance, and he did it all while knowing that the foundations he stood on were built from corpses and lies. The dissonance between his public image and his private reality became so extreme that sometimes he forgot which version was real, which Sanguinius was the truth and which was the mask. And deep in the genetic code of every blood angel, the thirst waited, patient and inevitable as entropy, ready to turn heroes into monsters. There is a number at which human suffering becomes abstract, a point where death tolls transform from individual tragedies into mere statistics. Sanguinius crossed that threshold somewhere in the 3rd decade of the Great Crusade and never found his way back. The worlds blurred together into a taxonomy of compliance. Those who surrendered immediately and were absorbed into the Imperium with minimal bloodshed, those who resisted and had to be broken through exemplary force, and those who defied the Emperor's vision so completely that they had to be exterminated down to the last breathing soul. The 9 Legion participated in all 3 categories with equal efficiency, and Sanguinius led them with a grace that made even genocide look noble. Melanchromatic was the first world where he truly understood what the Crusade was asking of him. It was a human civilization that had survived Old Night through radical technological modification, their population having integrated cybernetic systems so extensively that the line between flesh and machine had become philosophical rather than physical. They were stable, prosperous, and utterly uninterested in submitting to Terra's authority. The Emperor's Iterator Corps spent months attempting negotiation, offering trade agreements and defensive pacts, trying every diplomatic avenue to bring Melanchromatic into compliance peacefully. The Planetary Council listened politely to every overture and then, with the calm rationality that their cybernetic augmentation provided, declined. They had survived the age of strife through self-reliance, they explained, and saw no reason to surrender their autonomy to a distant emperor they had never heard of until his warships appeared in their system. The compliance order was issued within hours of the final diplomatic failure. Sanguinius read the document in his strategium, noting the language that transformed refusal into rebellion, that classified an entire civilization as traitors to an imperium they had never been part of. He read it 3 times, waiting for the moral clarity that should accompany such orders, and found only emptiness. Then he activated the deployment protocols and prepared to murder a world. The 9 Legion descended like angels of death, their assault pods screaming through Melanchromatic's atmosphere in precisely calculated trajectories that put them in optimal strike positions across all major population centers simultaneously. Sanguinius led the assault on the planetary capital, his wings spread wide as he fell from the sky like divine judgment, and the beauty of that descent was captured by a Remembrancer's picked feed and broadcast across the Imperium as inspirational material. The images showed the angel wreathed in fire, his face serene and terrible, a living embodiment of humanity's inevitable triumph. What the images did not show was the sound of his blade opening bodies from sternum to pelvis, the way cybernetic components sparked and fizzled when severed from their biological hosts, or the look on the defenders' faces as they realized that no amount of technological augmentation could stand against a Primarch's fury. The battle lasted 6 hours. The slaughter took 3 days. Because Melanchromatic's population did not stop fighting when their government fell, did not surrender when their military was annihilated. Every citizen had access to weapon systems integrated into their bodies, and they used them with the calm determination that comes from knowing you are going to die but refusing to do so quietly. Sanguinius moved through the streets of their capital and saw children firing laser weapons from hands that should have held toys, saw elderly figures with more metal than flesh charging Space Marine positions knowing it was suicide but doing it anyway because submission was worse than death. And he killed them all because those were his orders, because the Imperium's truth was the only truth permitted, and because stopping to question would mean acknowledging the monstrosity of what he was doing. When it was over, when the last resistance pocket had been purged and the 9 legions stood victorious amid the ruins of a civilization that had survived 15,000 years only to be snuffed out in less than a week, Sanguinius gathered his sons and addressed them from the steps of what had once been Melanchromatic's council chamber. He spoke of duty and unity, of the necessity of the Imperium's vision and the tragedy of those who could not see its glory. His words were poetic, stirring, carefully crafted to reframe murder as noble sacrifice. And his sons listened and believed because they needed to believe, because the alternative was accepting that they were monsters serving a dream built on bones. But in the privacy of his chambers aboard the Red Tier, after the fleet had moved on to the next compliance action, Sanguinius stood before a mirror and looked at his reflection and did not recognize the being staring back. The face was still beautiful, the wings still pristine, but something in the eyes had changed. They held the weight of Melanchromatic's 300 million dead, and that weight had carved out space where doubt should live but could not be permitted. So instead there was just emptiness, a numbness that felt like armor but was actually erosion. The visions began to worsen after melanchromatic. Not in frequency, but in clarity. Sanguinius would close his eyes and see moments from a future that felt inevitable as gravity. A ship's bridge burning, his brother Horus twisted into something unrecognizable, Terra's skies dark with falling debris. And in every vision, his own death, played out with variations but always ending the same way. Broken and bloody, having achieved nothing except the continuation of an empire that ground souls into fuel for its expansion. The visions were not warnings, they were prophecies, and prophecies could not be fought, only endured. He tried to speak to his father about them once, requesting a private audience on Terra between crusade deployments. The Emperor granted him an hour, which was more than most primarchs received, and Sanguinius entered the throne room with questions that had been burning in his mind for years. He wanted to know if the visions could be changed, if the future was fixed or flexible, if there was purpose to foreknowledge, or if it was just a curse that let you watch yourself fail in advance. The Emperor listened, his face unreadable, and when Sanguinius finished, he was silent for a long moment before responding. "The future is not written," the Emperor said, his voice resonant with harmonics that made reality feel malleable. "But some possibilities have such weight, such gravitational inevitability, that they bend all paths toward themselves. You see these moments because you are connected to them, because your choices will define their shape. Whether this is gift or curse depends on what you do with the knowledge." It was not the answer Sanguinius wanted, and the Emperor knew it, but there was no comfort offered because comfort was not what the Great Crusade needed. What it needed was primarchs who would execute the vision without hesitation, who would transform doubt into resolve and wield that resolve like a blade. So Sanguinius thanked his father for the audience, returned to his fleet, and never spoke of the visions to anyone again. He carried them alone, added them to the weight of the thirst and the lies and the countless dead, and continued to smile because the angel could not be seen to break. The campaigns blurred together into an endless procession of compliance and blood. The Orc Empire of Garghat VII that took 4 years to fully purge, where the greenskin spores kept regenerating the enemy population faster than they could be killed, forcing the 9 Legion to resort to viral bombardment that left the entire planetary surface a lifeless desert. The human collaborationist enclave at perihelion that had allied with the Eldari, earning them the distinction of being traitors to both species, and Sanguinius personally executed their leaders in a public ceremony meant to demonstrate the cost of Xeno's taint. The Diamond Spheres, a cluster of minor civilizations that had formed a defensive pact, which the Crusade broke by focusing overwhelming force on one world while the others watched, learning that unity meant nothing in the face of superior violence. Each campaign carved away another piece of the idealist who had unified Baal Secundus. That young Primarch had believed he was building something better, that civilization meant elevating humanity beyond mere survival. The warlord leading the 9 Legion across the galaxy knew better. He knew that the Imperium was not building, it was conquering, and the distinction mattered even if no one else seemed to notice. He knew that every world brought into compliance was not being saved but subjugated, their autonomy traded for protection from threats that the Imperium often exaggerated to justify its expansion. And he knew that he was complicit in all of it, that every order he gave, every battle he fought, was another brick in a structure that would eventually collapse under its own moral bankruptcy. But knowing changed nothing. Because the alternative to the Imperium was not some noble federation of free humans, it was extinction. The galaxy was hostile in ways that even Sanguinius's darkest nightmares could not fully capture. The orcs bred like a plague and could overwhelm civilizations through sheer numbers. The Eldari, for all their sophistication, saw humanity as either slaves or livestock. The things lurking in the warp, the entities that his father forbade the legions from even acknowledging, were patient and insidious and capable of corrupting entire species from within. The Imperium's brutality was not just policy, it was prophylaxis, a cauterization of anything that might weaken humanity's grip on survival. And Sanguinius understood this, accepted it even, but understanding did not make the weight any lighter. His relationship with his brother Primarchs became increasingly strained as the decades wore on. Horus, the War Master, noticed that Sanguinius no longer attended social gatherings unless required by protocol, that he kept his counsel during war councils and offered strategic input without personal commentary. Horus tried to reach out, suggesting campaigns where their legions could fight together, moments of brotherhood amid the endless war, but Sanguinius always found reasons to decline. Not because he disliked Horus. Quite the opposite, he loved his brother with an intensity that frightened him, but because being around Horus made the visions worse. Every time he looked at the War Master's face, he saw it twisted with corruption, saw the betrayal that was coming but could not be spoken of, because how do you accuse your brother of a crime he has not yet committed based on visions that might not even be real? So instead Sanguinius isolated himself, turned the 9 Legion into his entire world, and poured everything he could not say into making them perfect. He drilled them relentlessly, refined their tactics until they moved like a single organism, cultivated an aesthetic of martial grace that made their battles look like performances. The Blood Angels became known not just for their effectiveness but for their beauty, their ability to turn carnage into something that almost resembled art. And Sanguinius knew, with the bitter clarity of complete self-awareness, that he was using them. Using their perfection to distract from his own flaws, their nobility to paper over his lies, their loyalty to fill the void where his conscience used to live. The thirst continued to claim victims, more each year as the Legion's numbers grew. Sanguinius refined the containment protocols, built additional black site facilities, personally vetted every new apothecary recruit. The machinery of lies became so sophisticated that even he sometimes forgot it was there, operating in the background of his consciousness like autonomic functions. And through it all he led crusade after crusade, brought world after world into compliance, and wore the mask of the perfect angel so constantly that he could no longer remember what his real face looked like underneath. There was a night, after a particularly brutal compliance action that had required the 9 Legion to purge a hive city level by level to root out a genestealer cult, when Sanguinius stood on the observation deck of the Red Tier and watched the planet burn from orbit. The fires were beautiful in a terrible way, consuming oxygen and lives in equal measure, and he wondered if this was what creation looked like to his father. Just resources being reorganized, matter and energy shifting from one configuration to another, with morality being an inefficient concept applied by those too weak to see the bigger picture. The thought terrified him not because it was wrong, but because it felt true. And if it was true, if this was what he was becoming, then the angel had already fallen. The word came from Istvan III, fragmented Vox transmissions screaming through the warp with news that could not possibly be real. Brother legions firing on each other. Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's favored son, had declared rebellion. The Imperium was tearing itself apart, and Sanguinius received the notification while overseeing a compliance action on a minor agri-world whose only crime was being 3 months late with their tithe delivery. He read the astropathic message twice, his hands perfectly steady, and then he gave the order to halt all operations and prepare for immediate warp transit. The agri-world's governor, confused by the sudden withdrawal, asked if there had been some mistake with the paperwork. Sanguinius looked at the man and saw innocence that was about to be devoured by galaxy-wide civil war, and he could not find words to explain what was coming. "Lock down your world," he said finally. "Trust no one who comes bearing imperial authority, not even us, until this is resolved. Survival is the only loyalty that matters now." The governor stared at him with incomprehension as the 9 Legion extracted, leaving the agri-world confused but intact. It would be overrun by orc raiders within the year, its population enslaved or consumed, but Sanguinius would never know that. He had larger catastrophes to contend with. The journey to the Cygnus cluster should have been routine, a mustering point where loyalist forces would consolidate before responding to Horus's treachery. Instead, it was a trap engineered with a precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of the Blood Angels' deployment patterns and their Primarch's psychology. The system's warp routes were corrupted, filled with demonic entities that materialized on the Red Tier's decks and turned corridors into abattoirs. Brother fought brother again, but this time the enemy was not merely falling to the thirst. They were possessed, their bodies puppeted by things from the warp that wore their faces like masks. Sanguinius moved through the ship like a hurricane given form, his blade severing the connection between demon and host with each strike, but for every possessed marine he freed, 3 more fell. The Red Tier translated into real space above Cygnus Prime and found not allies but an armada of traitor vessels, and leading them was a ship that pulsed with energies that made reality scream. The battle was inevitable, so Sanguinius did not bother with posturing or negotiations. He simply gave the order to engage, and the 9 Legion crashed against the traitor forces with the fury of the betrayed. The void battle raged for 18 hours, weapon batteries carving chunks from ship hulls, boarding parties teleporting into enemy vessels to conduct room-by-room slaughter. The Blood Angels fought with a savagery that went beyond tactical doctrine, and Sanguinius recognized the signs even amid the chaos. The thirst was rising, the genetic flaw responding to the stress and horror by transforming discipline into hunger. He had to get his sons planet-side, had to give them an enemy they could see and kill before the flaw consumed them entirely. So he led the drop assault personally, his wings carrying him ahead of the pods, and he descended onto Cygnus Prime like a falling star trailing fire and fury. The planet's surface was a nightmare landscape, the ground pulsing as if alive, the sky filled with colors that did not belong in real space. And waiting for him at the base of a cathedral built from screaming faces was Kabanda, the Bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne who radiated such malevolence that Sanguinius's precognitive senses simply shut down in self-defense. The demon spoke with a voice like continents colliding, and its words were blades designed to cut at foundations. It told Sanguinius that his father had always known about the thirst, had engineered it deliberately as a control mechanism, a genetic kill switch to be activated if the 9 Legion ever became a threat. It spoke of the thousands of Blood Angels Sanguinius had executed in secret, mocked his nobility as performance, revealed that Horus knew everything and had shown Kabanda the sealed records as proof of the loyalist Primarch's hypocrisy. And whether the demon was telling truth or simply exploiting Sanguinius's deepest fears was irrelevant, because the words hit like bolter rounds and the angel felt something inside him crack. "Your sons are already monsters," Kabanda laughed, the sound shaking the air. "You simply dress them in pretty armor and call them heroes. But I see them, Angel. I see what they hunger for, and it is glorious." Sanguinius attacked not with technique but with rage, the careful martial discipline he had cultivated for decades evaporating in the face of a truth he could not endure. His blade met the demon's axe in a shower of sparks that might have been broken laws of physics, and the impact drove him to his knees. Kabanda pressed the advantage, its massive form bearing down, and with one contemptuous strike it shattered Sanguinius's leg, the bone snapping with a sound like a tree breaking in a storm. The angel fell, his wings tangling beneath him, and the demon raised its axe for the killing blow. What happened next would echo across 10,000 years and become the curse that defined the Blood Angels more completely than their gene seed. Sanguinius, broken and bleeding and filled with a despair so profound it transcended the physical, looked up at his death descending and felt something fundamental give way inside his mind. The carefully constructed walls that separated duty from desire, nobility from hunger, shattered like glass under pressure. And in that moment of absolute clarity that comes right before the end, he did not see the demon. He saw every lie he had ever told, every son he had executed in secret, every world he had burned in the Emperor's name. He saw the weight of his entire existence, and it was crushing, and he embraced it with a fury that burned hotter than any star. He killed Kabanda. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with a violence so extreme that it left the demon's essence scattered across 3 dimensions of real space and several layers of the warp. He beat the greater demon to death with his bare hands, his broken leg dragging uselessly, his wings beating the air in reflexive spasms that sent hurricane winds across the battlefield. And when it was finally over, when the demon's form had been reduced to dissipating ichor and screaming light, Sanguinius stood amid the carnage and realized he could not stop. The fury was still there, still burning, demanding more violence, more blood, more release from the pressure that had been building for decades. His sons had to physically restrain him, had to dogpile their pre-march while he raged and fought and screamed with a voice that was not entirely his own. And in that moment, something permanent happened. The psychic connection that all Space Marines shared with their pre-march, the subtle genetic link that let them sense his presence and draw strength from his will, transmitted the full horror of Sanguinius's breakdown across every blood angel in the system. They felt his despair, his rage, his utter loss of control, and the experience was so traumatic that it created a psychic scar that would never heal. The Black Rage was born in that transmission, a curse that would plague the blood angels across millennia. Because some of Sanguinius's sons did not just feel his anguish, they became it. They relived his battle with Kabanda, experienced his breakdown as if it were their own, and when they emerged from the vision they were no longer themselves. They were Sanguinius in his moment of greatest suffering, trapped in a loop of psychic trauma that could only end in death. The first to fall were 3 members of the First Company, veterans who had served for over a century. They tore off their helmets and screamed about the demon, about the weight of lies, about wings that could not carry them anymore, and then they charged into the remaining enemy forces with suicidal fervor, dying the way Sanguinius had not been allowed to. The apothecaries tried to contain the outbreak, but the Black Rage was not a disease that could be quarantined. It was a psychic wound that had been inflicted on the entire legion, and any blood angel could fall to it at any time. The visions came without warning, triggered by stress or injury or simply random genetic misfortune, and once they took hold there was no recovery. The affected brother would live out Sanguinius's worst moment over and over, his personality completely overwritten by psychic trauma, until he was granted the mercy of death in battle. Sanguinius stood in the Red Tier's medical bay and watched his son succumb to the curse he had inadvertently created, and he understood with perfect, terrible clarity that this was his true legacy. Not the victories or the noble sacrifices, not the worlds brought into compliance or the beautiful facade of perfection. His legacy was suffering. He had transmitted his anguish to his sons at a genetic level, turned his personal hell into a hereditary curse, and there was no way to fix it. The flaw was permanent, woven into the blood angel's psyche as deeply as the thirst was written into their flesh. He tried to explain this to Azkaelon, the commander of the Sanguinary Guard, but the words came out broken and insufficient. "I have damned you all," he said, and his voice was empty of the music that usually characterized his speech. "Everything I tried to protect you from, I have become." Azkaelon, loyal unto death, refused to accept this. "You saved us, my lord. You defeated the demon and broke its hold on the system. Whatever price we pay is worth your survival." But Sanguinius knew better. The price was not survival. It was damnation. His sons would carry the Black Rage through the centuries, would watch their brothers fall to madness wearing his face, screaming his words, dying his death. And they would do it knowing that their father had broken, that the angel was not strong enough to bear the weight of his own existence, and that weakness had infected them all. The realization was worse than any physical wound. Because Sanguinius had spent his entire life trying to be perfect, trying to be worthy of the worship and devotion his existence seemed to command, and in his moment of greatest trial he had failed completely. He had not maintained discipline or nobility or any of the virtues he claimed to embody. He had simply raged, lost control, and in losing control had cursed his entire bloodline with the echo of his suffering. The 9 Legion extracted from Cygnus Prime with a victory that felt like defeat, and Sanguinius looked at his sons and saw them differently now. Not as extensions of his will or reflections of his genecraft, but as victims. Victims of the Emperor's ambition, of the galaxy's cruelty, of their father's fundamental inadequacy. And there was nothing he could do to save them except continue forward, continue fighting, continue wearing the mask of the angel even though everyone now knew what lay beneath it. The siege of Terra was not war. It was the apocalypse given form and set loose upon the cradle of humanity. The traitor legions crashed against the imperial palace's walls like a tide of corrupted flesh and twisted metal, and every day brought fresh horrors that redefined the upper limits of suffering. Sanguinius stood on the Eternity Gate, the final barrier before the Emperor's throne room, and watched the horizon burn with fires that would take centuries to extinguish. The sky was black with falling debris, the air tasted of promethium and vaporized bone, and the vox channels screamed with death rattles from defenders who died in numbers too large to mourn individually. He had been fighting for 60 days without rest. His enhanced physiology pushed beyond even pre-march tolerances, and exhaustion was no longer a sensation but a state of being. His wings were ragged, feathers burned away by weapon fire and stained with blood that belonged to so many different sources, he could no longer distinguish friend from foe by taste alone. His armor was a patchwork of emergency repairs. Ceramite plates cracked and fused back together so many times that the original colors were obscured beneath layers of soot and gore. And still he fought, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean confronting the future he had already seen. The visions had achieved perfect clarity in the weeks leading up to the siege. No more fragments or possibilities, just certainty. Sanguinius knew how this ended. He knew that Horus would breach the palace, would teleport directly to the Sanctum Imperialis, and that he would be waiting there. He knew that he would fight his corrupted brother, would die in the attempt, and that his death would wound Horus enough for the Emperor to deliver the killing blow. The entire sequence was locked, inevitable, and Sanguinius had accepted it with the calm that comes from giving up the illusion of choice. What he had not accepted was what came before the death. The waiting, the pretense that there was still hope, the need to inspire his sons and the other defenders even while knowing it was all theater. He stood atop the Eternity Gate and addressed the combined forces of the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars who held the inner palace, and his voice carried across the Vox network with the resonance of absolute conviction. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of humanity's right to survive and the Emperor's vision of a unified species. He spoke of honor and brotherhood, of standing against the darkness not because victory was guaranteed but because surrender was unthinkable. And every word was ash in his mouth because he knew the truth. They were going to lose everything, and the only question was how much of Terra would be left standing when it was over. Rogel Dorn stood beside him, the master of fortifications whose life's work was being torn apart by traitor artillery, and even the Praetorian's legendary stoicism was showing cracks. "How much longer can we hold?" Dorn asked, his voice pitched low enough that only Sanguinius could hear. "As long as we must," Sanguinius replied, which was not an answer but was all he had to offer. Because the truth, that they would hold until Horus teleported past their defenses and rendered all their sacrifice meaningless, was not something Dorn needed to hear. The assault intensified as the traitor forces committed their reserves, and the Eternity Gate became the focal point of hell itself. Chaos Space Marines in armor that writhed with demonic corruption crashed against loyalist positions, and behind them came horrors that had no business existing in real space. Greater demons that towered over tanks, possessed titans whose weapons fired madness instead of ordnance, mortal cultists driven by faith in dark gods to commit atrocities that would haunt the survivors forever. Sanguinius met them all with blade and fury, his exhaustion transcended by something that went beyond mere stim injections or genetic augmentation. He fought with the certainty of the doomed, every strike precise because there was no future to conserve energy for, every movement committed because hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. Kabanda returned on the 58th day, the greater demon's essence reformed and hungry for the rematch that had been interrupted at Cygnus Prime. The bloodthirster materialized on the palace walls in a shower of burning blood and immediately began slaughtering everything within reach, its axe carving through space marine and guardsmen alike. Sanguinius saw it from across the battlefield and felt something like relief, because at least this enemy was honest. Kabanda did not pretend to be fighting for noble reasons or higher purposes. It simply existed to kill and corrupt, and there was a purity to that which made the combat almost cleansing. They met in the air above the palace, wings against wings, and the impact of their collision sent shockwaves that shattered windows across 3 districts. This time there was no broken bone, no moment of weakness where despair could overwhelm discipline. Sanguinius fought with the skill of a lifetime of warfare, his blade finding gaps in the demon's defenses that should not have existed, and when Kabanda finally fell, its essence banished back to the warp, the angel stood victorious and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just the hollow acknowledgement that he had survived one more battle in a war that had no good ending. "Is this what victory looks like to you, angel?" the demon's voice whispered as its form dissipated. "You stand atop a mountain of corpses and call it duty. You doom your sons to madness and call it legacy. And when you die, and you will die, they will make you a saint and use your memory to justify 10,000 years of slaughter. You were a slave pretending to be a savior, and the saddest part is you knew it all along." Sanguinius said nothing because there was nothing to say. The demon was right, and they both knew it, and the only response was to keep fighting because stopping would validate the accusation. The breach came on the 62nd day. Horus, grown to monstrous proportions by the powers of chaos, teleported directly to the vengeful spirit's throne room and issued a challenge that thundered across every Vox frequency in the system. He was aboard his flagship, he announced, and the way to him was open. "Come," he invited, "come and face the War Master. Come and die." It was a trap. Everyone knew it was a trap. Dorn wanted to refuse, to make Horus come to them, to fight the siege defensively until reinforcements arrived. But Sanguinius knew that reinforcements would not matter, that the only way to end this was to accept the invitation and play the role that destiny had written for him. So when the Emperor announced he would teleport to the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius volunteered to accompany him. Not to protect his father. The Emperor needed no protection, but because the script demanded it. The teleportation scattered them across the ship, a malfunction that was anything but accidental. Sanguinius materialized alone in a corridor that should not have existed aboard any vessel, its geometry wrong in ways that made his eyes water and his balance falter. The walls were covered in reliefs that depicted the Great Crusade, but every image was corrupted, twisted into mockeries of their original intent. There he was, the angel, in 100 different scenes of compliance, and in every one his face was a skull wearing a crown of black feathers, and his hands dripped with the blood of innocence. He walked through that corridor toward the throne room, and each step felt like moving through water that resisted his passage. The ship itself was aware, corrupted so thoroughly by chaos that it had achieved something like consciousness, and it hated him with an intensity that bordered on respect. "You could have been glorious," the ship whispered through its bones and bulkheads. "You could have embraced the truth of what you are and become a god of war and beauty intertwined. Instead you chose slavery to a corpse emperor and called it nobility." "I chose nothing," Sanguinius said aloud, his voice steady despite everything. "Choice was taken from me before I drew first breath. But if slavery to ideals is my fate, then I will be the best slave that ever served." The ship laughed, and the laughter sounded like his own voice echoing back at him. The throne room doors opened without touch, revealing a chamber so vast that its far walls disappeared into darkness punctuated by burning braziers. And in the center, seated upon a throne built from the wreckage of the Imperium's dreams, was Horus. Except it was not Horus anymore, not really. The War Master had been transformed into something that used his brother's face as a mask, his body swollen with power that crackled across his skin in arcs of multicolored lightning. He looked at Sanguinius with eyes that held the light of dying stars, and he smiled with a mouth that had too many teeth. "Little brother," Horus said, and his voice was layered with harmonics that made reality ripple. "You know how this ends. I have seen it in your eyes since the day we met. You know you are going to die here, and yet you came anyway. That is the difference between us. I fought my destiny, and you embraced yours. I am free, and you are still pretending that obedience is the same as virtue." Sanguinius drew his blade, the spear of Telesto, and settled into a fighting stance that had been refined across 2 centuries of war. "If my obedience saves even one life that your freedom would destroy, then I have chosen correctly. And if my death wounds you enough that Father can end this, then I die content." "Content?" Horus laughed, and the sound was terrible. "You have never been content a day in your life, angel. You have only been dutiful, which is not the same thing." The fight began with a speed that transcended mortal perception, the 2 Primarchs moving at velocities that turned them into blurs of motion connected by the trails of their weapons. Sanguinius had always been the faster of the Emperor's sons, his reflexes pushed beyond even pre-march standards by genetic enhancements that prioritized speed above raw strength. But Horus was no longer bound by genetics, no longer limited by the merely physical. The powers of chaos flowed through him like a second nervous system, granting strength and speed that should have been impossible even for a pre-march. The first exchange lasted 3 seconds and resulted in 417 distinct weapon impacts. Sanguinius's spear found flesh 14 times, each strike deep enough to have gutted a normal marine. Horus's claw strikes connected 31 times, and every impact shattered armor plates and pulped the tissue beneath. At the end of those 3 seconds, both Primarchs separated, their regenerative capabilities already working to close wounds that would have been immediately fatal to anyone else. "You are holding back," Horus observed, his tone curious. "Why? Do you hope that some fragment of your brother remains, that you can appeal to our shared past? I destroyed that weakness, Sanguinius. I killed the Horus you loved and wore his skin as a trophy. There is nothing left to save." "I know," Sanguinius replied, and his voice was sad in a way that transcended mere emotion. "I am not fighting to save you. I am fighting because if I do not, then everything I claimed to believe was a lie." They crashed together again, and this time Sanguinius abandoned the careful defensive style that had characterized his early attacks. He fought with the same berserker fury he had unleashed against Kabanda, channeling decades of suppressed rage and grief into every strike. His spear became a blur of silver light, each thrust aimed at vital organs or major blood vessels, and for a moment, just a moment, he had Horus on the defensive. The War Master's armor cracked under the assault, his enhanced flesh opening in wounds that smoked with the angel's righteous fury, and something like concern flickered across his corrupted features. Then Horus stopped holding back. The blow came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Horus's claw moving faster than Sanguinius's precognitive senses could track, and it took him in the chest. The talons punched through ceramite and bone with contemptuous ease, wrapping around his primary heart and squeezing. Sanguinius gasped, his body going rigid as his cardiovascular system began to fail, and Horus lifted him off the ground one-handed as if he weighed nothing. "Did you think your righteousness would protect you?" Horus asked, his face close enough that Sanguinius could smell the corruption on his breath. "Did you believe that your sacrifices and noble suffering would grant you plot armor in this final confrontation? There is no justice here, brother. There is only power, and you were never strong enough." He threw Sanguinius across the throne room, the angel's body impacting a support pillar hard enough to crack the reinforced steel. Bones shattered on impact, his secondary heart struggling to compensate for the damage to its twin, and his wings bent at angles that sent spikes of agony through his nervous system. He tried to stand and his leg gave out, the same leg Kabanda had broken at Cygnus Prime, and he realized with distant clarity that some wounds never truly healed. Horus walked toward him slowly, savoring the moment, and Sanguinius could see his own death approaching with the inevitability of sunset. He tried to raise his spear for one last strike, but his arms would not respond, his muscles shredded by impacts and internal bleeding. So instead he did the only thing left to him. He looked his killer in the eyes and refused to beg. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" Horus asked, standing over his broken brother. "I see a slave who convinced himself that his chains were wings. I see 10,000 years of your sons living and dying in your shadow, cursed by your flaws and inspired by your lies. I see the Imperium using your memory as a weapon, turning your sacrifice into propaganda, until even the truth of who you were gets buried under mythology. And I see that you know all of this, have always known, and chose it anyway because you were too afraid to imagine anything different." "I was never afraid of different," Sanguinius whispered, blood bubbling from his lips. "I was afraid of becoming you." Horus's face twisted with rage, and he raised his claw for the killing blow. "Then die afraid, little brother, knowing that your fear accomplished nothing." The claw descended, punching through Sanguinius's throat and out the back of his neck, severing his spine and several major arteries in a single strike. The angel's eyes widened, his body spasming once as his nervous system fired its final signals, and then the light began to fade from those perfect features. His last thought was not of regret or anger, but of relief. Because finally, after a lifetime of carrying weights that should never have been placed on any being's shoulders, he could stop. The masks could fall away. The performance could end. And if his death meant nothing, if the Imperium ground his memory into fuel for its war machine, at least he would not be there to see it happen. Sanguinius, the angel, the most beautiful of the Emperor's sons, died on the floor of the vengeful spirit's throne room, alone and broken, and his last expression was something that almost looked like peace. The Emperor found him there 30 seconds later, and what followed was a father's rage multiplied by godlike power. But that is a different story. This one ends with the angel's fall, with a moment when hope died and left only duty in its wake. The blood angels would carry his memory through 10 millennia of warfare, would build a mythology around his sacrifice, would curse his name and worship his legacy in equal measure. They would live with the thirst and the black rage, twin curses born from his flaws, and they would call it honor. They would paint their armor red in remembrance of his blood, would craft rituals around his death, and would never truly understand the being they claimed to venerate. Because the real Sanguinius, the frightened boy from Baal who wanted nothing more than to save his broken family, who carried impossible secrets and made terrible compromises, who smiled through decades of suffering because that was what angels were supposed to do, that Sanguinius died long before Horus's claw found his throat. He died the first time he ordered one of his sons executed for falling to the thirst. He died with every world he burned in the Emperor's name. He died in the throne room on Terra when he chose duty over honesty and became a symbol instead of a person. The body on the vengeful spirit's deck was just making it official. And in the grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium would remember him as perfect, as incorruptible, as the angel who proved that nobility could exist even in hell. They would be wrong, of course, because nobility was just another cage, another set of chains disguised as wings. But the Imperium was built on beautiful lies, and Sanguinius's memory was the most beautiful of them all. So let the historians write their hagiographies and the priests sing their hymns. Let the blood angels carry his curse and call it blessing. Let them die screaming his name in the grip of the black rage and believe it brings them closer to their father. Let the Imperium grind his sacrifice into propaganda and use it to justify 1,000,000 more wars. None of it changes the truth, which is this: Sanguinius lived in horror, died in agony, and the galaxy learned nothing from either. That is his legacy. That is his truth. And that is why, in the rare quiet moments between battles, when the Blood Angels look upon statues of their father and feel the weight of their genetic inheritance, some small part of them, the part they can never acknowledge without falling apart, understands that they were not saved by an angel. They were damned by a man who was never allowed to be anything else.